Pittsburgh is a magnificent skyline and a lot of wonderful places to look at the skyline downtown, but there is no place in downtown where you can look out at town and the rest of the city.
I think it's very interesting that here in Pittsburgh we have something that's so unique and so underutilized.
It's the largest, highest space on top of any building in the entire world. I mean, it literally is the roof of the world.
It's just a place ready for some expression.
And we started having what we would call the High Point Park investigation. It's a totally imaginary thing, but it could be real. And that's what we're trying to do, is to make this or some version of it a reality. The story really starts in August of 2001 when I was travel editor at the Post-Gazette, and the news came down that they were going to be closing the top of the Triangle, which was the restaurant on the 62nd floor of the U.S. Steel Building, which had for years had the reputation as the best view in Pittsburgh. And I wrote a column suggesting that the city find some way to make use of some of that space on the 62nd floor to provide the same sort of public viewing experience that you could get when you go to New York and went to the Empire State Building or the CN Tower in Toronto or the Eiffel Tower. I mean, every great city has a place where you can go and look at the view, and Pittsburgh is one of the great urban landscapes, but we didn't have one.
The U.S. Steel Building we're talking about today is the second newer U.S. Steel Building. It is 64 stories, 841 feet, by far the tallest building in Pittsburgh.
It's actually the 121st tallest building in terms of height or the number of stories.
The building itself is shaped like a triangle, and of course the downtown part of Pittsburgh is frequently referred to as the Golden Triangle.
Not only is it a triangle, but it's actually oriented exactly like Point State Park.
And so you have what the marketing materials when the building was built actually referred to the steel triangle within the Golden Triangle, and you have the sides of the triangle essentially, two of the sides essentially paralleling the two rivers, the Monongahela and the Allegheny.
You know, rooftops are fascinating places, I think, especially in high-rise building, you know, because it offers both from this kind of the city point of view, a point of reference. To me, it's very important for cities to have points of reference, to have landmarks, first of all, in a visual sense, number one, so that any visitor to a city could immediately recognize a city by those landmarks.
It sort of acts as an emblem of the city, and this was really quite conscious. I mean, not only do you have the connection to the steel industry, which, you know, sort of personified Pittsburgh for many years, but you also have the physical qualities where the U.S. Steel Building, in that sense, takes on the form of the city. It carries its skeleton on the outside. The steel that you see is the steel that actually holds the building up.
The whole, you know, fabulous kind of natural characteristic of steel can be, in fact, displayed and not being covered up by some other material. So for us as architects, that's a very exciting idea, right? To be able to get a material to be exposed and to be displayed in its natural state, if you like.
Of course, U.S. Steel was showing off its product line, so they chose Corten steel, which they were really pushing at the time as a sort of new invention for building.
When the building was finished, the literature called it the world's largest chunk of rust. Now, in this case, it is good rust.
The Corten steel is interesting because it rusts purposefully, but it doesn't corrode. And so you get actually a protective coating on the outside, so it's possible for the steel to be exposed to the weather.
And this is really the only building high-rise building that Corten is used so extensively. Typically, Corten steel are used for bridges, you know, and kind of low-rise structures.
And then secondly, you run into issues with fireproofing is the other reason why steel skeletons are usually internal to a building.
Traditionally, you would cover it all up with some, you know, fire protective material and thereby hiding the steel again, right? They came up with the idea of filling those columns with water. Now that's really another very creative idea. And that, until today, is the tallest water-filled structure in the world, until today. And so the idea is that the water fills up all this column, and in the event of fire, a pump will start up and the water will get circulated, thus removing the heat, so that the steel would never get to a temperature where it becomes dangerous.
Buildings, when they build them big, they tend to get narrower towards the top. Either they taper, or there's a number of columns, that tubes they call them, they get smaller. But when they built the U.S. Steel building, they built it so that the roof is exactly the same dimensions as the ground floor. As it turns out, it's an acre. Well, how wonderful would it be if we had an acre to wander around in? I mean, that's really a park-size experience. And unlike those other places, you're going to have the whole sky, the whole canopy of the sky over your head. To the west, you can see to Ohio. If you look to the east, you can see Laurel Ridge and Chestnut Ridge, which are, you know, the beginnings of the mountains. It's going to be something like you can't experience anywhere else in the world.
But it is a difficult problem. What do you do up there that is strong enough to compete or at least complement the building, and yet not overshadow the building? What do you do up there that makes sense at that height in terms of the human experience, as well as what it would look like from a distance as one is looking at the building? There are lots of different dimensions to it. So I think it's an extremely intriguing idea, but I think it's a difficult design problem, to be sure.
There are several, in my opinion, several very important characteristics that it must have in order to make it succeed. Number one, that it has to be an all-weather destination.
The business plan that comes should incorporate those factors and what they call the triple bottom line. The fact that it's green, the fact that it's self-sustaining, and the fact that it provides a civic benefit.
You've got to make it practical, functionable, and most importantly, a revenue drawing place. Otherwise, you know, who would want to invest and who would want to go there?
And so the idea of getting people up there to experience this view is a fabulous idea. The question of what you do with that much acreage in the air is really a difficult problem.
What is it that Pittsburgh is trying to tell or distinguish itself from other cities? One of the things that we've all been talking about is we want to turn Pittsburgh into a green and clean city, a sustainable city.
There was a certain bias maybe built into the project by calling it High Point Park, and talk about acreage and the sort of fashionable quality of green design right now.
We think that there are potentials for taking advantage of the sun and the wind to actually generate power, to capture rainwater, and to follow all of those green principles to create a space on top of this building which exemplifies the latest thinking in green technologies and sustainability.
I think the same innovative spirit needs to be brought to bear on that rooftop, creating a beacon that reflects that green idea.
I tend to think that whatever is done up there needs to be either more or less invisible from great distances, or it needs to somehow be very gestural and be strong enough to be seen from great distances, and if not compete, at least stand up to the massive steel object that we're working with here.
Whatever you design has to be maintained. And the simpler it is for that design to be maintained, and that all systems will continue to work well over a longer period of time, the more successful it will be.
So far, the group of folks that have been working on this problem in any kind of organized way has been a handful of, fewer than a dozen people, and it's really just been discussions. We've not yet been able to convince the people who own the building that it's a good idea, and we're still looking for funding that might help us advance our cause.
At the end of the day, I always like to say all things are possible. It's just a question of cost and investment. You'll be amazed, with support of budgets. what can be done, you know, in architecture.
For this idea really to become a reality at some point, it's going to have to evolve into an organization that is really capable of, that is separate from CMU and capable of managing and overseeing this really complex process that might actually result in something. Whether or not that happens, whether it's highpointpark.org or Friends of High Point Park or something like that, I see that as something that would have to happen for this to move forward. And what part that I play in that, well, that remains to be seen. I don't know. I mean, it's, I'd like to think that this moves forward and that I could be involved with it, and we could have a glass of champagne someday up on the roof. Back then, it was just an idea, and a very crazy idea, and it still really is just an idea. And but to begin to make an idea real, one of the first things I did was just started talking to people and say, hey, I've got this wild idea, and what do you think about it?